Hey everyone, Emily with Bob's Watches. I'm back with Justin and Ripley, and this week we're looking at some underrated and overlooked vintage watches.
Also, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date on our latest video content.
Before we dive in, we want to do a wrist check, so who wants to kick it off?
Ripley, what do you got?
I've got my old 16610 Submariner, my daily.
I was going to say trusty.
Yeah. I was wearing it yesterday, didn't take it off, woke up this morning, it's running, and said, why change it?
Can't go wrong.
Goes with everything.
Perfect. Yeah. I'm rocking a little vintage Cellini, kind of my classic style.
Very nice, kind of different. I like that K-shape.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Big fan of the shape.
Yeah. Today we're in the stainless steel Explorer 2 with the white dial.
Love it.
Yeah, it's a great watch. I like the color. I like the orange hand. It's fun. End up wearing it a lot. It's good. It's a good one.
So as we mentioned, today we're looking at some overlooked vintage watches. I think it's kind of exciting, the collection that we've curated. Ripley, why don't you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, so I think vintage Rolex watches are some of the most expensive, like flat out most expensive timepieces in the world. Paul Newman is $17.8 million, and you frequently hear about, this Daytona, that Submariner going six figures, $1 million plus. But that's not true for every single vintage Rolex watch. There's a ton that can be purchased for under 10 grand, under $5,000 even. And today we've got 5 fantastic picks that are not going to break the bank, and some of them, they're not super cheap, but they're really overlooked in context of their comparable other vintage siblings or even modern equivalents.
Okay.
So to kick it off, we've got the reference 5500 Air King. This is a model I actually own. Mine's very similar to this one. It's 34 millimeters, time-only movement, stainless steel. The reference 5500 is the first Air King model from the time that the Air King was made its own collection in 1958. The Air King name itself dates back as far as 45. The collection was created by Hans Wilsdorf to honor the World War II pilots. Ultimately in 58, it came as its own collection. There were other Air watches, Air Lion, Air Giant, Air Tiger. The Air King's the only one that still exists today, and it's now a line that exists. The 5500 was the first. Production of the 5500 started in 58 and remained all the way through the end of the 80s, so it's the longest running Air King reference. It's the only one fitted with a plastic crystal, and as far as a vintage Rolex Air King, this is kind of the one to own. It's smaller, it's pretty bare bones, minimalist feature set, but what's exciting about it to collect is there's a wide range of dials that were produced over that period of time. So if you don't like a silver stick dial, you can find one with more of an Explorer style. You can get them in blue, slate, black. And it just adds a ton of excitement and just variation, so you can find one that's a bit unique. And again, you can find these on the low end for under $4,000 or $5,000 all day long.
Yeah.
Pretty nice. I've been a fan of this in blue dial as I've seen them come through. This one's still just another great piece as well.
This one's cool. I like this a lot because, like Ripley said, it comes in a lot of different variations. If you're into the black, if you're into the silver, and also the size is good too. So it's 34, which is it's a little smaller than like the standard 36 or 38 to 40, but it's not too small that you can't wear it. And with vintage watches, having that smaller feel is kind of, it's kind of appropriate for the era, right? Watches were smaller back then, and I kind of like having the little smaller feel of my watch if it's a vintage piece. And this one, it's good. Like I said, it's small, but it's not too small. And the price is great. Like you can have, it's a really historic piece that can be had for under $5,000. I mean, it's hard to go wrong.
Yeah, and another thing worth pointing out is, so 5500 watches are powered by either the caliber 1520 or 1530 movement, largely depending on where they were sold. Neither of them are chronometer certified, so you can either find it with nothing on the lower half or with the words precision or super precision. This dial, as you can see, is very non-text heavy compared to other Rolex dials, and so if you wanted to swap out the bracelet for like a leather strap and wear it as a dress watch, this is a fantastic candidate for it. Time only, simple, and it adds a whole different versatile element that you can't quite do with a more sporty or necessarily maybe larger watch.
I love that. I was going to mention that same thing where, it looks great on the bracelet, but it looks great on any number of straps. You could get really crazy and fun with it. You could go with the classic leather. I like the time only. It's simple. It's really a versatile watch.
You guys are getting me into the strap game little by little. I think this is a perfect
candidate
option for it. Absolutely.
And as someone who owns that watch, it looks good on almost everything.
Ooh,
so
can't go wrong, can you?
19 millimeter lugs, which is worth pointing out. So your options are slightly more limited than 20, but 19 is such a common size in other brands that it's, I have no problem finding.
I prefer the 20, but with the smaller case size, the 19 really seems a little more appropriate. And like you said, while your options are a little bit limited, there's still plenty of stuff that looks good in 19.
Absolutely.
Well, this was a great overview. I'm excited to kind of scooch to our next watch. We've got an OysterDate. All right, Ripley, what do you know?
So honestly, any OysterDate watch is a underrated one in my opinion. OysterDate, not Oyster Perpetual. That means it's not a self-winding watch. It's a hand cranker, so you got to wind it every day. That's something Rolex doesn't do anymore.
Right.
The OysterDate came out actually after the Datejust, which is a self-winding watch, and so it took that date display and kind of expanded the concept, but also made it a more accessible package. So it's smaller, 34 versus 36 millimeters, hand wind movement, but you still get that calendar display. The very last, this one in particular is from the 50s, but the very last OysterDate model ended in 1989, which is 1 year after the Rolex Daytona got a self-winding movement. So the Rolex OysterDate is the very last hand-wind Rolex watch outside the Cellini collection, which is kind of its own thing. Hand-wind watches are kind of experiencing a bit of a resurgence right now. People like that kind of tactile relationship with their watch, kind of the ritual of winding it each day. And with Rolex's Oyster Perpetual series are, brilliant as far as day-to-day use, but you don't have to wind it. It's a set it and forget it type of mechanism. So this, you get a vintage watch. Look at the hour markers, look at the hands. You don't really see them. It's got a roulette date wheel. Very, very vintage.
Yeah.
And nothing that exists in Rolex's catalog.
Yeah, it's very cool. Like when you see the dial, instantly you can tell it's something that Rolex used to do and doesn't do anymore.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the standard hands or standard markers like you see on current Datejust or current Oysters. It's got a really cool vintage look to it. I love the roulette date wheel. The markers being that different shape are really interesting. Maybe it's just because I don't see them that often that I kind of like them a little bit more, but I really like the markers. And this one kind of is the same situation as the Air King where it looks great on straps. And here's a perfect example, right? Like here it's on a blue leather. I think it looks good on leather. It looks good on the bracelet. You could even put it on like a black alligator and class it up a little bit. And again, this is under $5,000 consistently.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that's two really good vintage Rolexes for under $5,000. I think that's great options.
A model that's found with a wide range of variation. And one other thing worth pointing out, you bring up straps, it's even better than the Air King for straps because it doesn't have as rounded of a case back. There's no rotor in there, so it's a bit flatter. And if you want to wear it on a NATO or a pass-through, it sits a bit closer to the wrist.
That's nice.
And let's just show it right here. Side by side with the Air King, you do see the case back doesn't bow out nearly as much there. The crystal sticks up, but the actual case itself is flatter. So again, very vintage, but also super overlooked.
Yeah.
And if you want something that's different and doesn't have a contemporary equivalent in Rolex's catalog, this is an obvious move at a price that's kind of hard to beat.
And the manual wind's a great touch, right? That's something that Rolex really doesn't do anymore, and it really gives you that this is a vintage watch feel. When you wind it every day, it kind of reminds you of that fact. And like you said, it's the ritual and the kind of romanticism of the way it used to be. And I think it's just great all around.
I couldn't agree more. Well, speaking of kind of that quintessential sort of vintage look, we're going to bring in this Oyster quartz so that we can discuss this. I know.
Now this is something different.
Yeah, much like the OysterDate, the Oyster quartz is, as a whole, anything with an Oyster quartz movement, in my opinion, is overlooked. This was Rolex's answer to the quartz crisis. It's not their first quartz watch. That was the Beta, the reference 5100 with the Beta 21. That was not an in-house quartz movement. The Oyster quartz is. The first Oyster quartz was in 1977. They produced it all the way up until the early 2000s. There's Datejust, Date, and Day-Date versions. And across all of those three types of watches, there's only about 25,000 to 30,000 total examples. So it's just a blip in the total. Millions of watches were produced during that quarter century. And Oyster quartz models across the board only account for a tiny fraction of them. In my opinion, they really should get a lot more attention. First of all, it looks so very much of the era, so very much of the 70s. It doesn't look like the standard Datejust, but it's legitimately rare.
It is. Out of all the watches we're looking at today, this one doesn't get very much attention, yet it's by far the most rare, or by far the least amount of pieces produced out of all of them. Right.
People think quartz, they think cheap, but this is the opposite. This is like Rolex everything. It's very over-engineered. This is a very well-done quartz movement, and this was what they were kind of banking on at the future at the time. Now, obviously, they went a complete other direction. They don't make quartz movements at all anymore, and what this is emblematic a fleeting time in Rolex's history that we probably won't see again.
Right. You have to remember that at the time, that was the new technology. That was the cutting edge. It was more accurate. You know, we thought this was going to replace manual wind and automatic watches. And Rolex, like you said, being Rolex, over-engineered it and made it the best. And, you know, this is a great example of it and a little snippet of history, because that, you know, it didn't go that way throughout history. You know, we kind of went back to the manual wind and the automatic watches, and now I think all quartz watches are kind of overlooked, right? I mean, there's some great examples, but as a whole, people tend to like their luxury watches being an automatic watch. There's almost like a little stigma with quartz.
Yeah.
And you know, this is a great little time capsule to me. And like you said, the integrated bracelet, I mean, it screams the era, right? It's
that's really rare for Rolex. You know, I think one of the reasons why the brand is held in such high regard is timeless, iconic, are two words, you know, almost always associated with their design language. And if you look at a Submariner or a Datejust or a Datejust from the 50s, and you look at one today, and the watches are still pretty similar.
They are very timeless.
And this looks like a dated piece. It's so rare to find a Rolex watch that dates itself, and every single oyster quartz does. This almost reminds me of a royal oak with the way the bracelet and the angular case, and they haven't done anything like this ever since.
Right.
This wasn't something they revisited at all. You know, the new date just looks more like the older ones than ever before.
It's so outside the box, and especially being the quartz too. You know, a lot of people, Rolexes are faked all the time. A lot of times they put quartz movements in, you know, fake Submariners, and they sell them to, you know, whoever, you know, wants to buy these cheap fake watches. And that's one of the number 1 things that they tell you, oh, Rolexes don't tick. Like the real ones have the sweeping second hand, and it's like, that's true. But actually, and then you have examples like this, which, you know, are kind of forgotten about, that they actually do make, you know, quartz, or they did make quartz, and they had a ticking second hand, and you know, they're a really interesting piece.
Quartz is quite polarizing.
And I think a lot of it is people, if you look at this quartz movement and you look at the quartz movement in your, you know, $20 department store watch, they don't look anything alike. It's worlds different. This is decorated. It looks like a fine piece of machinery, just like their automatic calibers. And you know, not all quartz is created equal. Yes, you see the hand still tick, but there is a vast range. Grand Seiko, Oyster quartz movements, Breitling does a really high end with quartz.
There are really high end quartz,
And so I think the quartz stigma is slowly beginning to kind of disappear as people sort of catch up with that. But at least at the present time, Oyster quartz watches are incredibly overlooked.
Yeah, I love quartz. I think it's good. I mean, I like automatic, I like manual wind. I don't overlook a watch just because it's a quartz movement. For me, I like the fact that I can put it down and pick it up in 2 weeks. As someone who wears different watches almost on the daily, and I don't have a watch winder large enough for my whole collection, that I like having the quartz, and I can put it up and I know it's the set time. And I don't overlook it for that reason at all. I think it's kind of cool, actually.
I love it. Well, definitely a watch that speaks to a moment in history. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in our next watch. We've got a Submariner. This is a 1680. Definitely not so much overlooked, but...
Yeah, I think to call any Submariner, you know, underrated or overlooked is, you know, not quite accurate. But in the context of vintage Rolex sports watches, where the sky's the limit, and in particular the Submariner, which is one of their most iconic and highly regarded models, where there have been known to have pieces sell for over $1 million. The 1680 is not the red line version, the later all white text, is remarkably underrated. So what you get with the reference 1680 is the first date display in Submariner, the only date display in Submariner with an acrylic crystal, and right now the price of a one like this with all white text is just $2,000-$3,000 more than the least expensive Rolex Submariner, which is the 16610 like I'm wearing. And to me that almost doesn't make sense. I understand where this one's price is at, but the fact that I can get its original counterpart for just a few $1,000s more, you know, it's a strong value proposition at that point.
And with other 1680s, with the red lines, you know, selling for double, triple, or even more for the same watch with a different dial, and you know, it does seem to be a relative value, right? I mean, it's not in the $5,000 range, but compared to those other vintage subs, compared to even the same vintage sub with a different dial, it's really seems like a deal when you start, when you start comparing those prices.
Yeah, it's quite a bit less expensive than like a 5513 or a similar era, but it was priced as the higher model at the time. The date displaying versions were just more expensive. 5513 wasn't chronometer rated. All 1680s are. But what you get is a matte dial, this really tall, vintagey top hat crystal, bidirectional bezel, stainless steel case. It's an inherently vintage watch, and you're paying negligibly more for what you'd pay for the absolute entry point into the Submariner ownership. So is it overlooked? I don't necessarily think so, but is it undervalued, underrated in regards to the other Submariners? Absolutely. And if you want a vintage Rolex sports watch, I'm having a hard time thinking of a model that would be more underrated, if you will.
I agree 100%. Vintage sports watches, I mean, we talk about vintage Rolexes being, very hot and very expensive, and really it's the sports watches that are, the pinnacle of that. It's the GMTs and the Submariners and the Sea Dwellers. And this is one that if you want to be in that category and you really want the sports watch, I'd say you're hard pressed to find more value for your money than the 1680 we have here.
Yeah, absolutely, and its direct successor, the 16800, has a sapphire crystal. The early ones still have a matte dial, but the overall, wrist presence is inherently more modern because of that change in crystal material.
This one feels vintage. It looks vintage, like you said, that big
non-quickset movement.
Yeah, exactly. It's a full vintage Submariner, and the price is. Like you said, it's not really overlooked, but it might be undervalued. Yeah,
a couple $1,000, $2,000 more than the cheapest, and you can get yourself an undisputed, serious milestone in the Submariner's history.
Yeah,
definitely one that needed to be involved in the conversation.
Yeah, we had to include at least one sports watch,
absolutely,
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a Milgauss 1019 that is still very much worth to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, so another model that's not cheap per se, it's vintage Milgauss, but when you kind of break down and kind of, unpack what the 1019 is, it's pretty special reference. So the Milgauss came out in '56, I believe, and then in 1960, the 1019 came out. So there's the 6543 prototype, the 6541, which kind of occupied those first few years, but both of those have a black rotating bezel, kind of look like an early Submariner. The 1019 came out, lingered in production for about 28 years until it was discontinued in the late 80s, and then the Milgauss remained discontinued until the 116400s came out way, way later. So it was just overlooked its entire period while it was in production and remains overlooked to this day.
Yeah.
It's Rolex's anti-magnetic scientist watch, but at a quick glance, it doesn't necessarily look all that different from an Oyster Perpetual or even a Datejust. It doesn't have the lightning bolt seconds hand, doesn't have any auspicious bezel, and so that's probably what hindered its sales. It was more expensive than an Oyster Perpetual at the time, and so they're pretty rare, despite the fact that they were in production for nearly 30 decades there.
I think the Milgauss as a whole is often overlooked, right? It's always and like you said, it's a scientist watch, and it kind of lives, to me, a little bit in between the sport and dress categories. It's not really a sport watch. It's not totally a dress watch.
It's a professional watch.
It's a professional watch, exactly. And for whatever reason, I think they just kind of get overlooked. And while this isn't an inexpensive watch, right? It's not one of the cheaper ones on the list. I think it doesn't get a lot of attention, and that has kept the prices from going crazy high, like on some of the vintage Submariners and GMTs that the prices are just through the roof. And to me, this is a really cool watch. I like the Milgauss a lot. I like the fact that it's a little bit different, and it's not something that you see all the time. It's not something that is really expected when you see a vintage watch. It's different, and it looks a little bit different. Like you said, it's kind of similar to the Datejust or some other things we see, and it doesn't have the lightning bolt seconds hand, but it does have a different seconds hand, right? It has its own seconds hand that's styled. The hands are different as well, so it has its own styled set of hands. The anti-magnetic is a nice touch. It's not something that's visually apparent on the watch, but it's kind of like in its own little category that, like you said, kind of often gets overlooked. And I think that's a shame, because I love this watch, and I think it's really a nice piece, and it deserves a little more attention.
It really speaks to its kind of vintage, I guess, kind of history, I guess, within its own model. It not looking so much like its modern day counterpart. It's just kind of nice that it really actually shows you sort of where it belongs within the range.
And it looks like the evolution. You can see the evolution of the Milgauss through this watch and its successors, where, like you said, the Submariner from before looks very close to the Submariner after it, looks very close to the Submariner today. I mean, they have made made updates and there were things to spot out. But this one, you can see where the seconds hand was turned into the back to the lightning bolt seconds, and it's just, you know, it's significantly different where it doesn't look like the modern Milgauss, and I think that's kind of nice.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the only vintage Milgauss you're going to be able to get for like under 6 figures. If you want one of the like a 6541 or like a 6543, which is basically a prototype,
right.
You're going to be paying a huge amount of money. This is, you know, kind of the only vintage Milgauss outside of those inaugural references. So it's the only one with the plastic crystal. It's kind of that Goldilocks size at 38 millimeters. So
yeah, it's a good size. It's not
perfect.
huge. It's not small. It's a really good size. And again, we talk about straps, and I think that's true for a lot of vintage pieces. They work well on straps, and I kind of lean into that. And a lot of times you find older ones and the bracelets aren't awesome. They've, you know, either been repaired a bunch of times or they're really loose or unreliable. And I love the fact that you can put on a strap. It fits nice, it's clean, and it looks great too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a bit thicker than a standard, like a Datejust of the same era, because it's got that magnetic shield. But because it's a vintage watch, its proportions are slimmer. It just doesn't have as much bulk. And you know, if you wanted to swap it out on a leather strap, if you wanted a Milgauss to like wear with your suit and tie to work around like the office, and you're working in a lab or something like that, this would be the absolute one I want. It's by far the dressiest. Yeah. It's the most kind of classically styled and versatile, but you know, it's a Milgauss, so it's completely anti-magnetic and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Pretty fun.
It's a good one.
I'm excited to see what you guys are picking out of kind of the full collection that we've reviewed today. So Justin, I will let you kick this off.
I am going to go right to that Milgauss.
Easy.
Without hesitation.
Yep.
I'm a Milgauss fan anyway,
yeah.
So that one, you know, kind of got some extra points right off the bat.
Yep.
But for everything we just talked about, I think it's a great watch. I think it's often overlooked, and you know, for a vintage Rolex, it's got my vote.
It's an easy choice. I wish I could be right there with you. I am to this much degree, but I'm pretty obsessed with sort of the rarity and kind of like that time capsule moment with this Oyster Quartz. It's an easy choice for me.
So I think for me, my favorite watch on the table would be the Milgauss, but I have to go with the decision I actually made and choose the 5500 Air King. This is the watch I actually own. It was my first Rolex, and I literally bought it because it was one of the most affordable, and it is way more than what I bought it for now, but not a day have I regretted it. And
has it ever served you wrong?
No, it's not chronometer certified, so there's no super stringent timekeeping things. Mine's from 1966, so it's it's non-hacking. It's an older movement, but I just remember it being my first Rolex, putting a leather strap on it, wearing to a wedding, and thinking I was very high on my own supply. So I just to just have that feeling, I love it. So I'll go with the decision I actually made in the 5500.
I'm proud of everybody's decision here.
Yeah.
This is a good one. You can't go wrong really across the whole board, but we're always excited to know what you guys are thinking as well, especially within this range. Is there something we missed? Tell us in the comments. We always want to know. Without question, we will be back for another Watch Talk, so thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can catch up on all of our future episodes.
But she's got actually one of the other vintage Rolexes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Is this an honorary mention?
Yeah, it's an honorary mention.
Well, let's get it in
I
here.
can just Kanye you for no reason.
Okay. The Cellini. We didn't have one
why don't you set it up?
Yeah, I'll take this off.
Yeah, I think honestly any older Cellini reference is undervalued.
Okay.
This is solid gold.
Solid
Rolex
gold.
Cellini, right?
Yeah, like all Cellinis, precious metal, solid gold or platinum. And we've said it before, what any Cellini, that's not the current generation cost, it's shocking for what you get a solid gold Rolex. Mm-hmm. That's again, one where you can find it for under $5,000 and you have a gold Rolex.
Yeah.
What is the overall stigma around a Cellini?
I feel like Cellinis are kind of divisive. Some people really like them and some people don't like them at all, and it's you're kind of in one camp or the other. I like them. I think they're cool. For dress watch, I think they have that very classic, what I want in a dress watch. It's very classic, it's timeless. This one has a little bit different of a case shape, which is kind of cool. And I think especially like as a lady wearing it, I think it's a good size, and it's, the shape, it's styled a little bit better, and I think it's a great choice.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue people have with it and why it just gets overlooked is Rolex has such a strong heritage of making these tough as nails tool watches, gone to the bottom of the ocean, Mount Everest. The dress watch just kind of gets pushed off to the side, and all of their great, legendary marketing materials, but Rolex makes some of the finest timepieces on the planet, and that includes their dress watches. So
Yeah.
if you're not climbing Everest or going to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, consider a Cellini. It's a fantastic piece.
Especially the vintage ones. I really like Rolex's new Cellinis. Their current line, I think, is fantastic. They're gorgeous pieces. The ones before, I was a little more indifferent on.
Yeah.
And then the vintage ones, I think, are great again. So it's like, I love the new ones and I love the vintage ones. And like you were saying, the price that you can actually obtain a vintage one for and have a solid gold Rolex,
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to go wrong.
I love this one, but I also love the wood dial one that I've worn before, which I know is a little bit not in the range of the ones that you enjoy the most, but I think that they're standout to me as far as just being different as a whole, and they're fun.
Yeah,
too.
They are definitely different.
It's the funky collection that's never been afraid to, try something different.
Yes.
So if you want a different looking Rolex, also consider the Cellini.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you stopped me. This was a good kind of honorary mention into the batch. So anyway, you guys, we'll be back again soon. We'll see you then. Until then, be well.